To really get what's happening in Ukraine, you've got to look way beyond the daily headlines. This isn't just a single event that popped up out of nowhere. No, it's this incredibly deep story about a nation's fight for its own identity, about the security of an entire continent, and at its core, it's a raw struggle for survival.
Think back to February 2022. The world was just stunned, watching as this massive invasion kicked off in Ukraine. We're talking about the biggest land war Europe had seen in generations. It was a moment that honestly changed everything, and it really shook up the global order.
So that's the moment we all remember. But the real question, the one we have to ask to understand any of this, is how on earth did we get to that point? Well, the answer is complicated, and it starts long, long before 2022.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we're going to look at the 2022 invasion, the event that captured the world's attention. Then, we're going to hit rewind and find out where this conflict really began. After that, we'll zoom out to look at Ukraine's centuries-long fight for its own identity, then explore the big-picture geopolitics, and finally, we'll pull it all together to understand what this war is truly about.
All right, let's start with the moment that had everyone glued to their screens, the full-scale invasion of 2022.
On February 24th, the Kremlin made its announcement, but they didn't call it a war. They called it a special military operation. Now, that choice of words was completely intentional. It was all about creating a specific narrative, one that was totally different from how Ukraine and most of the world saw it, as a straight-up, unprovoked invasion.
And that brings us to what might be the single most important question for understanding this entire conflict. Was that moment the real beginning? Well, if you look at the facts on the ground and listen to historians, the answer is a clear, resounding no.
So that leads us right into the conflict's actual more recent roots. You see, the 2022 invasion wasn't the start of a new war. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire that had already been burning for 8 years.
In fact, historian Serhiy Plokhy can give you a pretty exact date. He argues the war really began on February 27, 2014. Just knowing that one fact completely reframes the entire story, doesn't it? So what in the world happened back in 2014?
Well, it all kicked off in late 2013 with huge protests in Kyiv, known as the Euromaidan. It started because the president, who was very pro-Russia, suddenly walked away from a major agreement with the European Union. This sparked what's called the Revolution of Dignity, and the president was forced to flee. Russia's response was swift. They illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula, and at the very same time, they started backing separatist fighters in the eastern Donbas region, sparking a full-blown war that would just grind on for the next 8 years.
And make no mistake, this was no small skirmish. Before a single tank rolled across the border in 2022, this so-called frozen conflict had already killed more than 13,000 people. The war was already happening. It's just that most of the world wasn't really paying close attention. Yet. But to really get why all that happened in 2014, we've got to zoom out even further. The roots of this go deep, and they're all tangled up in Ukraine's centuries-long struggle to simply exist as its own independent country. Now, it's true that Ukraine and Russia share some ancient history, way back in the medieval state of Kievan Rus. But after that, their paths really diverged. For centuries, Ukraine's land was carved up by powerful empires. Then, in the 20th century, it was absorbed into the Soviet Union, where its national identity, its language, its culture were often violently stamped out. All of that changed in 1991, when the USSR collapsed and Ukraine was finally reborn as a sovereign nation. And a key, traumatic part of that history is the Holodomor, which means death by hunger. This wasn't a natural famine. This was a man-made catastrophe where Stalin's regime confiscated food, leading to the deaths of millions of Ukrainians. That event is seared into the national memory. It stands as the ultimate horror of losing control to Moscow. So you can imagine, when the opportunity finally came in 1991, the Ukrainian people were decisive. A jaw-dropping 90% voted for independence. This wasn't some narrow, divided decision. It was a powerful, unified roar for sovereignty that became the very foundation of the modern Ukrainian state. But here's the catch. Ukraine's independence placed it right on a geopolitical fault line. And that's what we'll get into now, this massive clash of great power interests that turned the country into a battleground. To understand this, some experts use a theory called structural realism. It sounds academic, but the core idea is simple.
It says that in a world without a global 911, it's the structure of power between major countries, the system itself, that drives conflict, often more than the decisions of individual leaders. It suggests this war was, in some ways, a predictable result of these huge systemic pressures.
And that leads us to this classic security dilemma. From the Western point of view, expanding NATO was all about extending security and stability to nations in Eastern Europe that were newly free and wanted to join. It was their sovereign right. But if you look at it from Moscow's perspective, that very same expansion felt like a direct threat, a hostile military alliance moving closer and closer to its borders and dismantling its historic sphere of influence. Two totally different realities.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head. For Russia's leaders, the threat wasn't just about missiles and tanks. It was seen as ontological, a threat to its very being, its identity as a great power. They saw NATO as an aggressor trying to unravel the cultural and political fabric of their region. So when Ukraine made it clear it wanted to join NATO, it triggered this incredibly deep-seated fear in Moscow.
So, after all that, what does this war really mean? Let's bring all these threads together now and look at the big picture.
Well, it seems this isn't just one war. It's really three conflicts happening all at once. For Ukraine, it is a war of sovereignty, the climax of a long historic struggle to be an independent nation. For the wider world, it's a war of security, a violent clash over the rules of the road for Europe in the 21st century. And on the ground, for the people living it, it's a brutal, bloody war of attrition, defined by almost unimaginable human suffering.
And we can never, ever lose sight of that human cost. Behind all the geopolitics and the grand history are real people. A UN report from August 2024 revealed a horrifying statistic. 95% of returned Ukrainian prisoners of war reported that they were tortured. 95%. That is the brutal reality of this war.
So, the war in Ukraine is this collision point where a nation's past and future, a continent's security, and, frankly, the world's future all crash into each other. The outcome is going to decide far more than just Ukraine's fate. It will shape our world for decades, which leaves us with the biggest question of all. What comes next?